So we'll kick things off, kind of make the most of everybody's time. So excited to have you all here with us today. Our topic this week is all about engineering-led supplier collaboration. So we're really thinking about what that looks like, how that's measured, and how that's best done. So we see all kinds of examples of CoLab, of folks kind of at every end of the spectrum, from doing really almost no engineering involved supplier collaboration, all the way to some really advanced, really kind of tightly integrated supplier collaboration. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Really, our agenda for today is kind of what the historical has looked like in terms of supplier collaboration and how it's measured, what we're seeing changing inside manufacturing organizations, particularly enterprises, but certainly we see how that kind of scales to everyone else. Why engineering-led supplier collaboration is becoming such a kind of key topic, and then what that looks like and how that's best done. So we're going to spend some time talking about that. We're going to talk to you a little bit about, for folks that use CoLab, what that looks like. For folks that don't use CoLab, some things that can kind of benefit teams as it relates to engineering-led supplier collaboration. And then we're going to leave some time for questions at the end as well. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box in your kind of Zoom window, and we will get to those at the end. I am joined by Jeremy. So my name's Taylor, Chief Strategy Officer at CoLab. This is Jeremy, our co-founder and CTO. So we'll jump right in. But first, probably unexpected, we're going to talk about baseball. Specifically, we're going to talk about the Oakland Athletics. Many probably familiar with this story, maybe wondering why we're talking about it today. So in 2002, the Oakland A's really turned baseball on its head in terms of how teams were valued and how teams were built. So up until this point, really the way that baseball teams thought about how to find the best players was based on this whole host of metrics, right? So things like batting average, home runs, steals, but also these really qualitative assessments, like they look like a good player. And ultimately, then you see teams with basically were valuing players the same. So there were players that had big price tags associated with them and tons that were more affordable. And really, in 2002, the general manager of the Oakland Athletics kind of turned that on its head. This organization had a very small budget, and they couldn't compete with the likes of like the Yankees or the Red Sox with the budget that they had for players. So they really had to rethink how players were valued. So if you think about that, a whole host of different metrics, like home runs, and if you look good playing baseball, they really had to question that. Are those the things that win games? Because we need to look at players that are potentially undervalued to be able to build a team. What they found was that those things weren't at all what translated into winning games. Those kind of historical KPIs were not actually what was showing up in the day-to-day. And success meant winning games meant runs, and runs meant players who get on base. So they really rebuilt their entire team around on-base percentage. The reason for bringing this up is not to go in deep on baseball. It's to talk about really the success of that. So in 2002, the Oakland Athletics became the first team in baseball history to win 20 games in a row. In the same year, the Yankees won the same number of games, but the Oakland A's did it for almost $85 million less. And so the message here and the theme here and why we're talking about it today is really to kind of beg the question of how do we measure success? And the old ways that success was measured in terms of what made a good player or maybe what made a good supplier might not be true in the environment that we're going forward in. Really, the message is to win, you need to think about playing the game differently, particularly true when circumstances are changing rapidly around you and competition is getting increasingly more difficult. And so, Jeremy, why don't you kind of jump in here and dive into this one?
Yeah, so supplier collaboration today, some of the themes that we see, one is that it's often owned, by procurement and by supply chain. And in, like Taylor said, the current environment, there's a lot of focus on minimizing cost and maximizing efficiency. And so a lot of teams look at interactions between these different groups, so between your engineering organization and procurement, or between your engineering organization and your supplier, as transactions, and look at it from a very process kind of efficiency driven perspective of how do we reduce those transactions. And that, you know, way of driving the process will often lead to other challenges. And so that's what we want to get into today.
Yeah, I think so what Jeremy just talked about is really what that historical kind of landscape for supplier collaboration has looked like. And now in our conversations for the past, say, 3 or 4 years, we've seen this massive upheaval of the supply chain system. So whether that be COVID, geopolitical conditions, we see this huge desire for engineering teams to bring agility, efficiency, resiliency back into their supply chain network. So when we think about that old way that Jeremy talked about, where it's very transactional, what a lot of engineering teams saw was that when supply chains got completely disrupted, they realized that that very transactional and kind of linear approach where supply chain talks to the supplier and supply chain talks to engineering internally, that just broke. It wasn't fast enough. It couldn't keep up with the pace of change. We had organizations that were swapping out parts constantly trying to get supply, having to make critical design decisions to swap those parts in and out and try and coordinate availability from suppliers. That takes a really rich, deeply connected method of communication to pull off. It needs to be very agile, it needs to be efficient, and it needs to be able to deal with those ups and downs. And so I think that caused a lot of engineering organizations to question, like, well, all of these measures of success that we've been using for so long, are those still the key measures of success in this environment that we're in? And so we see that so many of these organizations want to achieve that. They want to achieve that sustainably too, right? So let's say in the depths of COVID, when supply chains are just completely disrupted, okay, maybe we can get everyone on the phone constantly. We can, break down all these information silos really quickly. But then they see, well, we can't really sustain that level of communication, and maybe it's not the most effective communication. And so, we've seen that a lot of companies really struggle to implement this and also to measure it. Jeremy?
So another theme that we see here is those concepts Taylor just mentioned, like agility, resilience, efficiency, on their own are kind of difficult to gauge and difficult to measure. So a lot of the teams we talk to, they fall back on more tried and true downstream metrics to understand how things are going. So things like PPAP pass rate, first pass yield, product development cycle time, rework cycles. And those are good, but they generally are what we consider to be lagging measures. So engineering is now getting brought into this conversation. I think teams have come to realize that decisions being made in engineering and product development with suppliers have a big impact on some of these downstream measures and downstream success. But we're still measuring them using lagging indicators. And the result of that is that you have a pretty long feedback cycle. So some of the companies we work through, they're doing a lot of programs in parallel. They work through many in, say, the course of a year. And for those teams, maybe that works okay. You can go through a program, you can measure these things, you can maybe isolate changes you're making in engineering and actually see the results of that a little more quickly. But for the vast majority of teams that we talk to, programs are long enough and they're expensive enough and they're big enough of an investment and a risk that that long feedback loop between changes you make in engineering and with your supply chain down to production is just too challenging. And it's hard to really understand if what you're doing is having an impact. And so another theme that we see, and I touched on this a little bit a minute ago, is so companies will think about, all right, we want to drive these downstream metrics and we want to get engineering involved in driving these downstream metrics. So let's just put some process in place, particularly around how engineering engages with our supply chain. And the goal of this is to mitigate risk, hopefully avoid making mistakes. And so that kind of translates to long involved processes when it comes to things like RFQs, POs, change management with suppliers. Often things will have to actually flow through supply chain, and there isn't even a direct kind of connection there. And some of these processes can take weeks. And so the impact of that, I think, in today's environment, it's just not working anymore. And some of those downstream then metrics start to suffer. And I think that's what we're starting to see today.
Yeah.
So another theme that we see a lot when talking to companies is that although we've put additional process in place, there's actually time pressure in the other direction. Things need to actually happen faster. Turnaround needs to be quicker. So we'll hear things like, we only give the poor suppliers a few days to actually mark up, technical data that we provide them and ask questions, or, supplier collaboration is becoming very important, but we're still using tools like email, Teams meetings, in-person meetings to work with them. And so we have engineering being brought into these supplier collaboration initiatives. We're realizing that engineering needs to take some ownership of some of these downstream metrics. But we also are seeing that it doesn't really tell the whole story. These are lagging indicators, so it's difficult to make quick changes and really see the impact that it's having. And it's not really working anymore. In today's environment, that long feedback loop, it's just not really working anymore. And so what we want to explore in this talk is if that calculation is no longer downstream metrics, if they're improving, we're going to have success, then what is it? What is that calculation? What is our version of on-base percentage?
Yeah.
And so we like to talk a lot about engineering-led supplier collaboration. When we think about this, I reflect a lot on my last sort of engineering design job before starting CoLab, and that was at Tesla working on the original Model 3 battery pack, where I designed injection molded components, wire harness components for that vehicle. And Tesla back then did things a little differently. As a design engineer at Tesla, I actually would engage directly with the tier 2 suppliers of the companies in Asia who were manufacturing the plastics components. And we would, share designs directly, get feedback from them directly. And even still, I felt that that whole process was a little slow. We were doing it over email, PowerPoint decks, and spreadsheets. And I thought there has to be a better way. It was a part of the genesis for starting CoLab and building the product that we provide. But even still, we at least had that direct connection between engineering design and the supplier. And I often think about, I can't imagine working in a way where you don't have that direct connection. And the reality is a lot of companies are. And we like to think a lot about, how do we actually flip that around and really drive engineering-led supplier collaboration?
Yeah, and what we're seeing is that it really, really matters. So what we're seeing and what we hear from leadership across these manufacturing companies is that decision making has a compounding effect on the product. And these decisions, these critical product decisions, are made every single day, primarily in design review. So if you think about a week in a world of new product development, there are thousands of decisions being made. Right? Like individual designers are making thousands of decisions as they work through a new product, and then teams get together and they make the big ones. The rate at which you can make those decisions and the rate at which you can make those informed decisions, so getting the right folks involved as early as possible, that's going to have a compounding effect on the product that comes out the other side, right? Like at the end of the day, the product you're building comes from a series of decisions that are made. What we see is that the teams that make great decisions, that compounds and it results in not only one good product, but a series of good products, a high quality product, and ultimately a strong brand. On the other side, if a series of poor decisions are made, from what product should we build, how should we build it, who should we work with on it, all the way down to quality decisions that turn into warranty claims and the like, obviously then we see declining customer trust and poor brand. So this stuff really makes a big difference. And ultimately what we see here is that when these conversations happen and who is involved are really the two most important pieces. So our perspective, as we talk to a lot of engineering teams that are kind of in that old way, let's say, And the process looks pretty linear. So these various cross-functional groups are engaged once or a handful of times throughout the process. And typically we see most of the feedback, most of the issues come up to like the middle to the end of the life cycle. So if you're thinking about stage gate, you know, it's somewhere between kind of the second half of that process is where we see a lot of the issues get raised. We all know that the later you find an issue, the more expensive and the more time consuming it is to change. It has the greatest impact on your schedule. It has the greatest impact on rework and whatever else. So what we see as sort of that much stronger approach to engineering collaboration and particularly supplier collaboration is how we can bring that earlier. So if you can compress the cycle by having cross-functional conversations and supplier or customer conversations in the detailed design phase, and really as early as possible, you're going to get higher quality feedback and you're going to find those issues a lot sooner, which is going to enable you to pull that risk forward when it's really easy to change. We are seeing customers, large manufacturing organizations, completely skip planned rework cycles because they can bring all that feedback up front. And as an example, like maybe you're going to hear if you give a supplier more than, you know, a couple days to look at 25 technical documents or whatever it is, you're going to get great feedback. You're going to get more complex feedback maybe, but it's earlier in the process so you can actually do something with it. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we see the most innovative companies thinking about engineering-led supplier collaboration. So there's really 4 kind of key themes that we see. The first one is bringing in suppliers earlier, what we just talked about. The second one is creating a secure information ecosystem. The whole point of that is basically to enable you to securely share more information with suppliers. So not just, hey, here's the specific component I need you to build. Can you build it and how much will it cost? But here's the component. Here's why I need the component. Here's how critical it is, what it interfaces with, really allowing you to have that more rich conversation. Breaking down internal communication barriers early and often. What we mean there is kind of what Jeremy described, allowing engineering to talk to engineering, right? We see too often engineering talks to supply chain talks to supply chain, who talks to supplier engineering. And that is just a really slow process that breaks really quickly. And then lastly, introducing the right tools and processes to enable that direct communication with engineering, to enable information to be shared securely. We see that as kind of like a last piece that's really critical. So first one here, bring suppliers out of production into design. What we mean by that is really straightforward. Give suppliers access to CAD, 3D if they're kind of at a level of sophistication where that works for them. In whatever ways you can. And for most companies, there's still a lot of drawings involved, but if they can get access to 3D models alongside those drawings, that's going to bring a lot of context for the right supplier. Communicate design intent and confirm design and product capability. I heard a story from an automotive company who outsourced a component to whoever was the cheapest, basically, who could make this tiny little plastic component. They went with a company that was primarily served consumer goods. They had no idea how critical the component was, the design intent, how it was used. That product failed, and it caused a recall on a huge product line. Why does that happen? Because that supplier had no idea the requirements of that product outside the scope of how big is it, what's it made out of, and then you don't have the ability to leverage the expertise of that supplier who makes components like that every day and kind of knows if that's going to work or not. The best companies leverage suppliers for design innovation. So they don't just want to know, can you meet that tolerance? They want to hear more innovative feedback, should I mold this as 1 part instead of 2? They want to hear kind of that more thoughtful feedback than just, can you do this and how cheap can it be? And then get information into and out of design. The second one here is about that 2-way information bridge. So really enabling suppliers to have up-to-date access to information. So not just one drawing that they're getting via email, you're 3 revisions ahead and they haven't, seen those. Give them change notification in a really meaningful way so that they can kind of be in lockstep with you, and give suppliers and internal stakeholders access to one another so that we can really cut through the noise and have that direct communication. This is maybe like one of the most important things here. I think it can be scary for a lot of supply chain folks to think that engineering is going to run wild with communication directly with suppliers, and that makes sense. So I think it's important that the roles and responsibilities, swim lanes are clearly defined. Here's what you are to talk about. Like here's the decisions I'm going to be responsible for. It's not to say that engineering needs to make all the cost decisions or selection or anything like that. But by allowing R&D technical folks to talk to technical folks, ultimately better decisions are going to be made faster than if they have to kind of play a game of broken telephone. And then the last one here is introducing the right tools and processes. So it's easier said than done, right? To enable more data to be shared, information and communication to be contextual, engineers to talk directly to engineers, supply chain to be able to be involved in all those communications and make the right decisions that are kind of in their roles and responsibilities. So we see that the great technology needs to be in place to enable that. And obviously that's a big part of what we do at CoLab. Jeremy, over to you.
Yeah, so we started this off by talking about needing to rethink the way that we think about the game of supplier collaboration, and that there's a lot of focus on downstream metrics. So in this next part here, we want to talk about what we can focus on instead then to drive good engineering-led supplier collaboration. So here we outline some proposals, but I want to focus on sort of a bigger theme here, which is engagement. One of the main things I think you can think about and look at when it comes to upstream measures of how well we're doing engineering-led supplier collaboration is engagement. How often are we engaging with our suppliers? What is the quality of that engagement? And one of the challenges today, I think, is that a lot of the systems we use don't actually give management or companies a good way to see that and to understand that and to get a feel for how much engagement is or isn't happening. So you imagine going back to the Moneyball reference, if Billy and team had no way of measuring on-base percentage, they wouldn't have been able to pursue the strategy that they have. So one of the big important things here, I think, is to figure out, if you want to go down this path, how you're actually going to get a sense of the level of engagement that's happening. Then within that, I think there's some other core things. So we outline here like number of comments, quality of comments, number of issues resolved. To draw an analogy with the work we do, we're a software company. In software development, you have this concept of pull requests, and it's kind of like design reviews, but for folks who write software code. And you want to look for like a balance. You want to see that reviews are happening often and that they're happening a little more granularly. So very quick, kind of frequent reviews is what you're looking for. And you want to see that there's a lot of discussion happening, but the right kind of discussion, so good quality discussion. If you keep seeing kind of common themes coming up over and over again, that's maybe not great. You want to see very specific and potentially high impact issues being discovered and discussed and then addressed. So you want to look for a good balance of amount of feedback, the right kind of feedback, and a good level of engagement here. And our whole kind of thesis here is that that's the right upstream thing to be monitoring and measuring. And you want to think about how can we get some processes, but also tools and systems in place that would allow us to measure that. And so we've had some good success with customers in doing this. One example I really like is Mainspring Energy. So there's a case study on our website you can go and read all about, but they went through a whole kind of cost reduction redesign of their energy generation unit. And CoLab could help them, with the supplier engagement aspect of that. So they maybe had an idea for how they could reduce the cost of something. It was going to involve their supply chain. And so they would kind of put the question out to them, in the evening, and they would come back in the next morning and they'd have a response from the supplier. And that's quite a step change compared to like spending a few days putting a PowerPoint deck together, sending that over, not hearing back from them until early the next week, which really kind of slows things down. So that quick, frequent kind of discussion and feedback loop really help them achieve that better, and then towards the end have less defects even than you would normally have. The next thing you're going to want to do is think about the business case. So, we're proposing thinking about a different way of measuring, monitoring, and driving good engineering-led supplier collaboration. That doesn't happen for free. You need to invest in tools and processes and people. And so in order to get the buy-in to do that from your company, from your team, you need to have a good business case. And there's a lot of different things I think you can look at, and we work with our customers, and they often have different things that they look at here. But ultimately, you're going to want to look for less rework down the road. So if you have good supplier engagement, good supplier collaboration, eventually you should expect to see that when you move to kick off soft tooling or into production, that less problems are coming up and that you move through those phases of the program more quickly. And the ultimate downstream kind of effects of that are getting to market more quickly, less cost impact during production, etc. So you want to think about the business case here. I think that's also a very important piece. So summarizing everything, there's a lot of different things to think about here if you want to get into this. One of the first is, who's my Billy Bean? So you're going to want to either step up as or identify someone who's a really strong engineering leader that's willing to kind of take on this challenge. It is a challenge, and often, they may be trying to do this, on the side of their desk as a sort of separate initiative here or an additional initiative. And that's not easy. So you're going to want someone who's really passionate about this, really cares about it, has the vision and sees it, just like Billy Bean, with the Oakland Athletics. The other thing you need to do is refocus on the right tactics and the associated metrics. So we've given kind of a pitch for why we think that the right theme of metrics there is engagement. You really want to look for good engagement between your engineering team and your supply chain. The next thing is cross-functional acceptance. So in the movie Moneyball, if you remember the scene, they're around the table, and Billy Bean is pitching this strategy and having to look at on-base percentage, and everybody is kind of saying, hey, you're crazy, they're frustrated. You're probably going to have some meetings with your team just like that, where you're saying, this is important, here's the strategy. We think that engagement is going to equal good production runs, which is going to equal wins, just like on-base percentage equals runs equals wins. And your team's probably going to think, this is going to be costly. Why are we doing this? They're going to have a lot of questions. And so you're going to have to work through that. And I think one of the ways to work through that is, again, to identify very clear ROI for the company and for the business, and to keep coming back to that, keep reiterating, just like how he keeps pointing to Peter Brand in the movie. You need to keep reiterating that, I think, for your team. And then again, like we mentioned, right tools and processes. So if you can't measure on-base percentage, they would have never been able to have that strategy. If you can't measure supplier engagement or engineering to supplier engagement, you're not going to be able to drive this strategy. And one of the big challenges there right now is the tools that teams are using just give no way to measure that and to monitor that. So you need to also think about the tools and the processes.
Cool. So we're going to open it up to questions. Jeremy, we're 30 minutes on the dot. Look at that.
That's excellent.
Please do. You can punch questions into the chat. And then we also have the QR code here if you want to get access to the presentation and that sort of thing. But yeah, ask away. So I'll stop sharing my screen here and open up the chat. Okay. Hello, Mary.
Hey there. I think you might not be able to see this since I'm the host, so I'm just going to rattle off a couple of the questions that got submitted, if that's okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. You bet. So we know you guys are from CoLab. Have you seen any other tools that teams are using to achieve engineering-led supplier collaboration today other than CoLab, or maybe even in conjunction with?
Jeremy, you want to take that one?
Yeah, for sure. I think this actually lines with another question I saw in here as well, around how this integrates with the rest of your tech stack. So I've been having myself a lot of conversations with some of our customers and prospective customers recently about how you could integrate sort of an engineering supplier collaboration tool with your supplier kind of process and purchasing tools. And the big player in this space is SAP. I think most companies are using that to drive things like RFQs, POs, change requests with suppliers. And honestly, I'm also a big believer in, like, if you have the tools there, try and invest in those and use them. And I think there are a lot of parts of this process that tools like SAP are capable of. You need to invest in it a bit. You're not going to get it for free, but there's certainly lots of kind of cleanup and hygiene around those existing purchasing tools that you're using that can help things here as well. So, a lot of companies are looking for other solutions and additional things to bring in. I think that's great. I would also encourage, look at your existing purchasing tech stack and think about what improvements can you make, what customizations can you make, and how do you integrate these things together in a way that's really useful. So maybe you could set up a system where when you kick off an RFQ event, in SAP, you automatically spin up a technical collaboration room. Maybe that's CoLab, maybe it's something else alongside with that, so that you can have a good, rich technical discussion back and forth with your suppliers as well. We have some other questions coming through. I can answer one quickly, Taylor, about interaction with PLM tool. So yeah, that's a big thing for us. We work with larger companies, larger organizations, and in fact, we look for teams that are using PLM systems and have a good strategy around data management and product lifecycle management. The main thing that we need to interface with there is just engineering data. So how do we kind of share engineering data in a seamless and secure fashion between those two solutions? So we actually have out-of-the-box integrations for a lot of the large PLM solutions like Windchill, Teamcenter, 3DX. Some of these are more recent. We're announcing soon. But yeah, we have integrations with those PLM solutions. And the two main goals usually are, how do we make it easy to just share technical data? Because that in and of itself has always been a huge challenge, actually, and especially with respect to supply chain. Just the extracting and sharing, downloading, viewing of the technical data, hugely painful. We often try to avoid it by just providing screenshots and PowerPoint decks and things. And that in and of itself is just a big challenge. So our PLM integration is one of their main goals, is just make that process easy. Like, click a button from your PLM solution, share technical data into a collaboration space where a supplier can just click a button in their email and get access to it in their web browser. So yeah, we integrate directly with those tools. We actually think that's a big, big part of what a good design engagement system can do, is make the sharing and accessibility of CAD data easy.
Yeah. There's another question here, Jeremy, that I think would be a good one for you to answer. Let me just read it. So it says, we talked a lot in this presentation about 3D, so sharing 3D data with suppliers. But obviously there's a lot of other types of data that are critical for suppliers. So specs, standards. It says specifically managing supplier feedback, especially when it arrives in spreadsheets laden with various cost attributes, can be quite challenging. So the person asking the question wants to know, how do we handle these aspects of data management and collaboration?
Yeah, so I can speak to what we have done as CoLab. Maybe there's some broader perspective to this question as well, but we as a company have focused a lot on 3D. One of the reasons is because this whole philosophy of trying to move upstream. And so, usually upstream in product development process, you start with CAD. And so we care a lot about 3D, because we believe if you do a good job of that, you can start to engage and have conversations earlier in the process. But I think one of the value propositions of our software is that we've taken the same sort of engagement and feedback and review system and wrapped it around all different file formats. So in CoLab, the same way you engage with 3D, you provide feedback on 3D, it works the exact same way on drawings, it works the exact same way on documentation. We're actually about to launch Office file support as well, so things like spreadsheets and other things. And so especially when engaging with suppliers, you really need to keep things simple. And part of keeping it simple for us is that we just have the same sort of review and feedback system that you interact with across all of these different file formats. And I think that helps a lot. There's certainly some deeper aspects, I think, to your question around like cost data, et cetera. We do some things to try and allow you to have specific conversations around cost in our software. So you can actually enter some cost information, in feedback when you provide it. So if somebody's saying, hey, I think we should change this particular thing, you can actually specify like, well, this is the anticipated cost impact for it. And so we have started thinking about some of that as well. The other thing I'll say, the last thing I'll say with respect to this question is, like I mentioned a minute ago, I think you have a whole tech stack here, right? And a technical collaboration solution, and it's maybe just a part of it. Some of these other tools like SAP and other solutions do parts of this well, and maybe you just need to look at like, how do we integrate these things together? How do we make sure that it's kind of easy to move between contexts, or if you want to link some of this data to other parts of the data. But yeah, there's certainly a lot to think about here, but these are just a few of the things that we do to try and help with that.
Yeah. I see another one here. I can take this one, Jeremy. It says, how can teams make this work when working with, 10, 20, 30 suppliers at a time? I think this is all the more reason to do that. It might make that more challenging, but certainly it's all the more reason to do it. We saw a huge trend post all this kind of supply chain disruption that things are getting. Everything has to be double sourced or triple sourced or whatever. And so I think it's all the more reason that you need a system to help you manage these communications. Obviously, when we're talking about, some of the things that we're kind of pitching for is sharing more data, direct communication, allowing engineering to speak directly with suppliers, more, and more kind of rich conversations. And more earlier and more often feedback. That is challenging, right? That you need to come up with a way that scales. And I think what teams saw was that in the kind of chaos of like major supply chain disruption, they were finding ways to get the job done with literally like a phone call, in-person meetings, flying overseas, whatever they could do. But that doesn't really scale well when you have a massive global supply chain. So how we see teams pull this off is really where the tools and systems come in place. You need good scalable processes that allow kind of that ability to share information while protecting IP, the ability for contextual communication from engineering, but something that automatically tracks all that information so someone doesn't have to keep track of it in a spreadsheet. I would say like that scale is really achieved with like good tools and processes.
There's another question there, Taylor, that I think is an extension of the PLM question I can tackle.
Yep.
So how do you update the data and monitor the product configuration? Yeah, that's a great question and a very deep topic, but I'll try and touch on it at a high level. So, one of the things, again, we've done with our PLM integrations is make it easy to just reshare updates. But when you share something to CoLab from a PLM system that we integrate with, we actually will keep sort of a digital link between the two systems. And so we can identify, hey, you've previously shared this thing to this space. We're going to create it as a new version in CoLab, and we'll actually pull through, the revision, version, and lifecycle state information from the PLM system on the CoLab side. So when you provide feedback in our system, we can tell that this was specifically on version B.4 from the PLM system. Then when you uprev, you can add new feedback that gets tied directly to that new revision. So we actually have that kind of traceability of here's the feedback that was provided at each stage, and also linking it back to your revision and version info coming from PLM. This year, we have some projects in the pipeline around allowing you to set up some better syncing tools there. So we're working on something called Sync Once Shared. The basic concept there is once you share it to CoLab, we would then, if you configure it to do so, keep it in sync with your PLM system. So that helps address the question of, once I share something to CoLab, how do I make sure it doesn't get out of date? And then without getting too deep into the details of our product, we do have this concept of workspaces and portals when you're working with suppliers. And so you could have it set up to automatically kind of sync data into your workspace, which is like an internal space, but still be in control of exactly what versions get shared out to the supplier so that they're just not automatically getting all kinds of new updates, which you probably also don't want. Configuration is another deep topic. The CAD viewer that we have does have the ability to, and the concept of configurations within CAD. Of course, there's also the concept of configurations within your PLM system and your product management system. I would say that's a much kind of deeper topic and something we're thinking about with respect to how our integrations work. And it does depend on the CAD system, the PLM system, the company, their philosophy around how they do things. So that one's a much deeper topic, but certainly thinking about that side of things as well.
Yeah. Lots of product related questions. It's awesome. I think these next two questions are good for you as well, Jeremy. I love this one. You teased a product update, and now Mike is holding your feet to the fire. I'm wondering if you could share a timeline for a Microsoft Office docs viewing in markup.
Yeah, that's coming this quarter, so very soon. And yeah, you'll be able to push just like native docs to CoLab, not have to export them to PDF, and then be able to view them and mark them up just like you can view PDFs in CoLab now. And that's been a very hotly requested feature since the beginning of time for us. So we're pretty excited about that one. I think there's certainly like further we can go with that too in the future, but just getting that capability to like view and review them, I think is going to be exciting. And again, especially when you think about a supply chain context where there could be all kinds of different, questions there.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a follow-up. So the initial question we got there around, talking a lot about 3D, but like there being so much more, I guess, to a design review than just a 3D model. The question being, one of the kind of early issues this person encountered with early 3D design was that the 3D wasn't mature or high quality enough to elicit meaningful feedback from suppliers. So maybe you could speak a little bit to this issue, Jeremy, and some kind of potential ways to address it.
Yeah, I think that's a great question and a great concern, and it gets into like some of the more philosophical parts of this, right? Like whether almost challenging the premise, like whether you really should be doing this, because there can be risks associated as well. One thing I'll say is that 3D hygiene is always a good thing to be working on, and the more mature you can have 3D, earlier in the process, obviously better. That's kind of like a given. But a couple things that we think about and we try to do to help here is just give you tools to be able to focus the review in CoLab, and even say it's with a supplier. So you can go in, and once you upload the data, you can add your own sort of annotations to say, ignore these things. I'm specifically curious to get your feedback on this thing. And you can also set up reviews, and when you close them out, you can kind of lock down, the feedback, so that you don't have suppliers or other people just digging too deep into the wrong things or going too far. Mm-hmm. The other thing I would suggest is you can always also share, drawings in combination with 3D. So if you want to also wait until the 3D is a little bit mature and you do have some initial whip drawings, you can share the drawings with 3D to hopefully help with some of the clarity there. Yeah, I think it's a good question, and you really kind of just need to build a good relationship there with the suppliers and be very clear about the review intent and what it is you're trying to ask them. And if you can provide other things like drawings, images, documentation that helps clarify certain things, that helps. Yeah, that's a good question, and something I'd love to hear from other kind of teams on how they accomplish or manage that as well.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head though, Jeremy, that it's probably gonna take time for certain suppliers that are used to being brought in really late to adapt to what it looks like to be brought in early. much in the same way that engineering teams will have to get used to leveraging that expertise. But I think we talked a lot to suppliers too, right? Like to suppliers who primarily work with OEMs. And what we hear is that they know that they have a lot of expertise on their particular components, their particular specialty, that could be gained by being brought in earlier. So I think as long as that kind of expectation is clear that, hey, we're really early in this process, even if the 3D is not super mature, or if you're not sharing 3D at all, right? Maybe you're sharing napkin sketches. It doesn't matter so long as you can kind of give them greater context and bring them in as early as possible.